Hello, I'm Michael Millum, Interim Pastor of Amazing Grace Lutheran Church in Lawrenceville, Georgia, and I hope you are blessed by the hearing and preaching of God's Word today.
In seminary, we were taught that Matthew is the most Jewish of all the Gospels. The reasons why the experts believe this to be so is that again and again in the Gospel of Matthew, and we hear an example of it in the reading that I shared with you just a moment ago, Matthew demonstrates how Jesus' words and actions fulfill the prophecy of the Hebrew Scriptures, especially the prophecies of Isaiah. And then in addition to this, Matthew goes out of his way oftentimes to draw parallels between the life of Jesus and the life of revered figures from the Hebrew Scriptures, especially Moses. Matthew demonstrates numerous times in the Gospel that Jesus is like a new and greater Moses. And the purpose of this for Matthew is so that he can convince the Jews that Jesus is their Messiah. So Matthew wrote his Gospel originally, intentionally, for the Jews that might become followers of Jesus. This is what has long been believed by the gospel. And if that is the case, it makes it all the more remarkable that we have the story of the visit of the Magi as the centerpiece of Matthew's birth narrative. Why? Because the Magi weren't Jews. Who were the Magi? Well, it's probably going to be easier for me to help explain this to you by telling you who they weren't. They weren't wise men, in spite of the fact that that's what the translation I read to you this morning calls them. In fact, a New Testament scholar by the name of Raymond Brown says that is far too generous and charitable a designation for them. And they weren't we three kings of Orient either. The Magi were a strange conglomeration of magicians. In fact, magi is where we get our word magic and magician from. Magicians, fortune tellers, astrologers, dabblers in alchemy and all of those ancient arts. So they were strange people, these magi. They did all sorts of odd things, and they engaged in incantations and sorcery. And as far as the fine, upstanding, Bible-believing Jews were concerned, they were quacks. They were given no credibility whatsoever. Well, you tell me, how much credibility do you give to your daily horoscope in the newspaper? Or to the people you get on the other end of the line when you call 1-800-FORTUNE? This is what we're talking about here. These were Gentiles, they were pagans, they weren't Jews, they weren't people of faith in particular. And so it is strange that in this most Jewish of all the Gospels, the Magi would play such a key role in the birth narrative of Jesus. As I say, the Jews gave the Magi no credibility whatsoever. They were strange visitors indeed. So what is Matthew's intention here? What is the point he's trying to make by including the Magi in his birth narrative? Well, quite possibly what he's trying to say is that even though he's writing to the Jews, that the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, is greater than the Jews, and greater even than all of us. Now, my having declared that, I'm certain some of you probably are saying, well, duh, that's what we've always been taught, right? Jesus came for all people, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. Yes, that's what we have been taught, and that is what we affirm time and time again in the church. But even though we may acknowledge this with our lips as the truth, living that out as the truth is sometimes a bit more challenging for us to do. You know, we had some strange visitors recently as well on Christmas Eve. We always have visitors on Christmas Eve. Some of them, no doubt, were strange relatives from the east or from the north or from out west somewhere bearing gifts. And some of them, I'm sure, were nominal worshipers, people that we don't see very often in the life of the church, who pop in only once or twice a year. And you know how these people are ordinarily identified in the church, right? We call them the Christmas and Easter only crowd. And very often when we talk about those folks in the church, what we say about them is not terribly charitable. We treat them as though they are unwelcome party crashers. I've even heard colleagues of mine, pastors, call these folks out during Christmas and Easter services, essentially declaring that you are not welcome here if you're only going to come twice a year. I got a call one time from a local reporter when I was still living in Connecticut, asking for a comment. This was right before Easter, on how I felt about the folks who pop into church only on Christmas and on Easter. And my reply was, well, I'd rather have them in church twice a year than not at all. And I would certainly hope that they would receive the same kind of hospitality and welcome from all the people of the church. But we know that that isn't always the case. So when we have strange visitors from the East or wherever they come from, how do we welcome those folks? Do we make them feel at home? Do we extend Christ's hospitality to them? Or do we treat them like strangers and oddballs and outsiders? I'm certain that some of you are acquainted with Yao. Yao is a Vietnamese young man who shows up periodically at our church. We won't see him sometimes for weeks at a time, and then without any warning at all, he will just walk right in to the office during the weekday and sit and engage the staff in conversation. And sometimes he shows up on a Sunday morning too, except the majority of the time when he comes on a Sunday, he'll show up before the service starts, and then he won't come in and worship with us. Instead, he'll go outside and maybe talk to somebody else who's waiting to be here for the 11 o'clock service. And I think one of the reasons that Yao continues to return to Amazing Grace is because he has found some measure of hospitality here. People have welcomed him and established a rapport with him and have talked with him eagerly whenever he comes. Now, one of the things that Yao will do if he's talking to you is he will tell you, I'm not a Christian. I'm not a religious person. And sometimes he has even said to me, I'm an atheist. But he is clearly a seeker because he keeps coming, searching for something he knows not what. But strangely, on Christmas Eve, December the 24th, he came right before the 10 o'clock service that day, and he stayed for worship. That's the first time I've observed that, and the first time I believe it, and perhaps it's ever happened. And he also stayed for the 5 o'clock Christmas Eve service. So he hit us up twice on Christmas Eve. And at both of those services, he was escorted down the aisle by a member of our church to receive Holy Communion. Now, as I've told you, Yao does not regard himself as a Christian. I'm pretty sure that he has never been baptized. And yet, I was not going to make that a sticking point on Christmas Eve of all times. I believe that the living Jesus Christ, who is present to us in the bread and wine of Holy Communion, would welcome Yao to his table just as he does the rest of us insiders every week here at Amazing Grace. So there you go, Lud. After your experience in the Roman Catholic Church recently, all are welcome at the table. This is how we live out the truth that Jesus Christ has come for all of us. And getting back to those strange visitors that we have on Christmas Eve, have you ever noticed that they know the words to the Christmas carols we sing, and they sing them just as passionately as we do? So who is to say that they should not be present on that most holy day when Christ has come for all the people? Now, the story of the visit of the Magi is normally regarded as an epiphany, not a Christmas story. And that may surprise you to hear that somewhat, because we always see the coming of the Magi depicted on the day of Jesus' birth, and they come to the stable just as the shepherds have done. But that is not at all how the story is recounted in the Gospel of Matthew. The Magi don't show up until much later. possibly as long as 2 years after the birth of Jesus. So the Magi, their visit is celebrated ordinarily on our Christian calendar on January the 6th, which was yesterday. That's why we're still celebrating Christmas in the church today, because we are only 1 day removed from the Epiphany, and I thought that it was appropriate for us to read this story and celebrate the coming of the Magi, even though it is January the 7th today. It's an Epiphany story. Epiphany means revelation. And it's interesting, these are, as I've said, pagans. They're not people of faith. They're not Jews. They have not had the benefit of the revelation of the Holy Scriptures or even the announcement of the angels as the shepherds got on the day of Jesus' birth. The only revelation these Gentiles receive is a brilliant new star in the sky. And in the ancient world, heavenly signs were often believed to be an indication that someone of significance had been born on earth. So if you saw a comet in the sky or a shooting star, that might be the indication that a king has been born. So the Magi are able to look up at the star, and it is revealed to them that a king has been born. And so they pack up their belongings, their gold, their frankincense and myrrh, which is probably elements that they used in their incantations, and they follow the star all the way to Judea. It was a very long journey, probably more than 1,000 miles. The Magi very likely came from ancient Persia, which today would be modern-day Iran or Iraq. That is a long trip to make. They come all that way because they have the instinctive understanding that this child who has been born king has been born for them too, and they have come to pay him homage. And so the first thing the Magi do when they get to Judea is they stop off in Jerusalem, the capital city, to pay their respects to King Herod. It is only right and fitting protocol for them to do that. And so they enter into the king's presence, and they ask the question, where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? Now, the title King of the Jews is Herod's title. And so what the angels say is good news for all the people is bad news for Herod, to learn that someone has been born who will eventually take his place on the throne. And so he turns to the chief priests and the scribes of the people and asks them, where is the Messiah to be born? And the scribes and the chief priests have an answer for him right away. In Bethlehem of Judea. But here's the thing. The scribes and the chief priests are the experts. They are the authorities. They are the scholars. If anybody should know that the Messiah has been born, if anybody should have been able to read the scriptures and understand the revelation that comes there, or understand the meaning of that star in the sky, it would have been the chief priests and the scribes. But they didn't get it. They didn't know that the Messiah had already been born. Jesus was born while Bethlehem slept. And by that I don't mean that he was born in the middle of the night, although he very well might have been. He was born while those who were awaiting him, who had been longing for the coming of the Messiah, were not paying attention. Even the chief priests and the scribes of the people have no idea that their Messiah has come, although they have longed for him to come for more than 500 years. And so they need these quacks, these pagan, these magi to come and tell them what has happened right under their very nose. Their king, their Messiah, has come. Light and darkness are recurrent themes from the scriptures. In fact, in our first reading today, the prophet Isaiah tells us about the light and the glory of the Lord that has risen upon a people living in darkness. Light and darkness are themes that we deal with throughout the time of Epiphany. And they are themes in our spoken liturgy this morning, and they will be themes in our singing during the course of this service. They already have been in our opening hymn, I Want to Walk as a Child of the Light, and in our closing hymn today. So we now are the insiders. We are the experts, the authorities. And we, of all people, ought to be able to recognize the presence of Christ that has dawned among us in the light of the revelation that he brings. And yet, do we? And what do we do with that light that has broken in upon us? Hide it under a basket? No. In fact, that's what we will sing in our concluding hymn, This Little Light of Mine. It is our calling to become beacons of that light, to shine that light into the lives of those who are outside of our community, the outsiders, the strangers, the visitors that we sometimes interact with, people that we don't necessarily want to communicate with, but nevertheless we have received the call of God to reach out to them, to invite them, to extend Christ's hospitality, to love them, and to make these words we affirm that Christ has come for us all become flesh in our actions and in our attitudes towards those strange visitors from the East.